Hey everybody, this brief video is designed to get you ready to write the methods section of your research proposal for our class. Remember, the methods it comes after the introduction, where you review the literature and you funnel down into a specific problem that needs to be addressed through your research question. So in a traditional research study, chapter 1 would be the introduction, chapter 2 would be the review of literature, and chapter 3 would be the methods. Obviously, we're condensing that so that the first section of your paper in our class should include the introduction and the review of literature, and then the second part of your paper will be the method section. And you know you're ready to write the method section when you can answer the question about how specifically you will collect your data. So when you're thinking about what the method section should look like and what the tone of your writing should be, the simplest way I can make it is to say that you will be able to answer these two questions that you see on the screen for the reader. So if I'm reading your paper, you should write the method section in such a way that I feel like I can trust your results, that I feel like your explanation of the data, and better yet, your answer to your research question seems plausible to me. It seems like it follows from your arguments, and it seems, more importantly, like it follows from your data. So basically, you have to convince the reader that you've taken steps to make sure that your data is good. That your data, meaning by good, I mean you're collecting the type of data that you should be collecting in order to answer the question. And that means basically that you're very clear on your variables and that you are using instruments to collect data that actually measures things related to your variables in specific ways, so that for me as the reader, I can come away from your paper saying, it makes a lot of sense, and you fully addressed the question that you intended to address, and then I can translate your findings for myself. If I'm a sport manager in any context, I take your results and I can easily, or at least I can trust my ability to translate those results into my coaching, let's say if I'm a coach, or into my leadership if I'm an athletic director and your study relates to effective leadership practices. So the first question I need to be able to answer for the reader when I'm writing my method section is, what have I done to make you trust my results? The second is maybe even simpler. You should write the method section in such a way that someone could replicate your study. They could they could set up their own experiment or their own survey or their own qualitative interview or whatever. Essentially, if they replicated your data collection methods, they could, if they wanted to replicate your data collection methods, because it's clearly spelled out and you've clearly indicated the process by which you collected the data so that the reader could replicate the study if they need. So the method section can feel kind of boring to write, because in this way you're almost writing it like a recipe, for collecting data to build a research project. So in that way it feels not like the most exciting part of the paper you'll write, but hopefully you see this is sort of where you show, and it's a good way to check to make sure that your study has been designed appropriately and that you are clear on the type of data you will collect. Because remember, we keep saying the more clear you are on the type of data you need and what your variables are, the easier and the cleaner and the more effective your research project will be. So here's an overview of the elements that should be in your method section, regardless of whether you're collecting numeric quantitative data or textual qualitative data. You should have a very brief introduction, followed by the sample and settings where you describe who your subjects or your participants are, and then you get into the nitty-gritty of the recipe of the procedures by which you'll collect data, and then finally a couple of lines introducing how you will analyze the data once you collect it through your procedures. So the introduction is just a brief transition between The introduction to the method section is a transition between the introduction section that came before it, where you review all the research and you funnel it into a research question, and now you quickly introduce through one line the purpose of the study is to collect, and then you list your research design and the type of data you'll collect. And then you quickly go into the sample and the setting where you describe your participants. Who are they? And it's different in how you describe your subjects. Yeah, a quantitative research study gives more numeric data about your subjects. How old were they? And what we call demographic variables. Any characteristics about your sample that the reader should know in order to trust the data. Remember, the whole point of quantitative research is to collect a representative sample that represents the population or the larger group from whom you are drawing the sample. The larger population that you want to say something about when you get to your findings. I should say quickly as well, remember on Blackboard that there are many different examples of different types of proposals. So as you write this method section, I don't want you to try and read my mind. Read previous examples of articles that you're already digging into for your study and look at their tone and look at how they set up the method section. And if you plan to collect similar data, they collected numeric data and you're also going to collect numeric data, then use their example to guide your own method section. Similarly, if you're going to collect qualitative data, find good qualitative articles that you've used in your lit review and use their examples, as well as the examples that I leave for you on Blackboard. Again, after you fully describe your sample, who are they, how did you get access to them, how did you recruit them, and do you limit them in any way? If so, how? Then you go into procedures, and we'll talk about each of these sections in the coming slides. This is where you describe your instruments for data collection, how you got them, whether you used someone else's survey or experimental design or theory for informing your qualitative interview questions, or if you built your own, you talk about what instruments you built, how they can be trusted. Remember, the two words here are reliability and validity, and you want to establish for the reader why I, if I'm the reader, should trust your data given the instruments that you used to collect the data. And then again, analysis is how we're actually going to analyze our data in order to answer the research question. So we already talked about sample and setting, but a couple of more specifics here. Remember, quantitative and qualitative research collects different types of samples. Quantitative research wants as many people to participate as possible. The more people you have participating, the stronger your statistical analysis can be, and the more you can assume that whatever happened in your sample is true for the larger population that you want to say something about. Qualitative research, we called the sample purposeful. I don't care necessarily about how many people I have. I care mostly that they're the people that I need to interview or observe, or the participants that I need to provide in-depth, holistic, qualitative understanding about lived experience. So remember, a few weeks back we said qualitative research is interested in those things: holistic examination of lived experience, often involving social phenomenon. So I pick the people who can best give me that reality, who can best provide qualitative, meaningful information. And I talk about how I accessed them and how did I determine, or how did you determine, who will be included or excluded. Inclusion and exclusion criteria are specifically important for quantitative research. If I'm studying the effects of a certain diet, let's just say, for example, the specific diet is veganism, then I'm going to purposely recruit people who either have been vegans, or they are consenting to be vegans, or they agree to participate in this diet that is vegan. So I have to decide whether I want to continue with people who have been vegans in the past, or if I'm going to introduce a new diet to people who were not vegans, if I want to see, let's say, the impact of switching from a diet that includes meat to a completely vegan diet, then I might recruit people from all different types of diets as long as they agree to switch over to veganism. But if I want to look for the health benefits, ongoing health benefits of veganism as a dietary choice, then I might recruit only current vegans. So those are just two different examples of how I can choose my inclusion criteria. You get to decide. The point is you should include or exclude people according to the variables that you want to measure. Similarly, in qualitative research, you will describe why you chose the people you chose. So normally we give basically some background on the people we chose so that the reader can see, and it makes sense for them, why we chose the people we chose. Once we describe who the subjects or participants are, then we have a couple lines about how we informed them of their rights to participate. So this whole idea of informed consent and what rights the participants have, we're going to leave for discussion in our course next semester in the spring. But for now, this is also where you'll talk about how you informed your participants of their rights to be included in the study and their rights to withdraw at any time, and the steps basically taken to protect those rights of the participants. So throughout this PowerPoint presentation, you'll notice that I give specific examples by each section of the methods part of your paper. This is just for you to go back and see some more details. My purpose here is just as we talk about the different sections that you will include as subheadings within your methods portion of your paper, I want you to see just some examples. You don't have to copy these examples, but they're just examples for you to get a feel for how these might look. So this is a physical education example of your participants, describing them. How many will you have? 396. How will you select them? They'll be randomly sampled from a population of all the different PE teachers in public or private schools in the state of Iowa. Wow, pretty large sample. And then it talks about how you gain access to this random sample. And then you give a little bit more breakdown of how, based on gender and any other demographic characteristic that matters for your project. So you get to decide how many specific details you share. The point is that the reader should know enough about your subjects and your participants that when they're reading the data, they can compare the data in terms of who your participants are, because the idea in a quantitative study that this example is quantitative is I as the reader am always trying to see is your sample representative of the larger group of people that your study attempts to examine, and so these demographic characteristics again explain and provide the believability for your reader that you need. So here's an example of a qualitative portion of the sample. So this would be a sample subheading within a qualitative methods section. And you can see how different the language is. There's a little bit more of an explanation about how who the people are that's qualitative in nature. Where do they come from? What is their background? Because the idea, again, is believability related to who it is that the study intends to examine. All right. Now we're headed into the second portion of the method section, and this is the procedures. So I didn't write procedures here, but it should be procedures on the title, and then the first part of the procedures section is the design. You remind the reader about what research design you're using. Is it quantitative or is it qualitative? And you might even give the specific data collection design that you'll be using. Remember, from a quantitative perspective, most of you will choose a survey, but you might say this quantitative survey intends to examine, and then you list your variables, or this experimental design, and then sometimes you'll even, if you say experimental, you might even include your data collection strategy in terms of, is it a moment in time cross-section or is it a recurring time series design? Remember, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. So you'll include what the design is, and then that sentence will end in terms of specifying your variables again. Same thing with qualitative. You'll often read, instead of saying this qualitative study, you'll often read in a methods section, you'll often hear this grounded theory or this ethnographic study examines, and then you hear a listing of the qualitative variables that the researchers intend to examine. And here's an example of some language that would be included in a quantitative experimental design. So often you'll see specific details related to what your experimental design would be. So you see quasi-experimental, you remember that term from a couple weeks ago. It's a pre-test, post-test with a control group. So we know this is pretty high level. They may not have achieved a perfect random assignment into groups, but they do have a control group to compare their treatment group with, and then you talk through how will you control, what will the treatment be, and what are the independent versus dependent variables. So this is a nicely written design related to a quantitative study. After the design, the statement of the design is listed, or a couple of sentences, then you get into the sort of the recipe for data collection, where you answer the question of how did you collect data if someone wanted to replicate your study, and also to enhance the believability of your data. So you talk about the instruments. Did you use valid, reliable instruments? On a quantitative study, you talk about the survey and who designed it, and what were the tests that they did to make sure that the survey was reliable. It obtained consistent numbers as well as valid. It actually measured the items or the variables that it claims to measure. In a qualitative study, you'll talk through how did you write the questions for your interview guide, or how did you develop the field guide or your observation guide for the observational study or for the content analysis. So you still describe strategies for making sure that the data you get is trustworthy, but we've said before the terms used are a little different between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research talks about the reliability or consistency of the data and the validity of the data. On the qualitative side, the trustworthiness basically relates to the validity of your data. If something, well, and the reliability. So qualitative research often use the word trustworthiness, but then another word that they use is authenticity. That's synonymous with validity. So, like all things, qualitative and quantitative research, they use different terms because they're after different basic approaches to the research. The idea is the same, though. We want to make sure we get quality data, and we want to protect our data as much as possible from bias or from basically inconsistency. Here's an example of a qualitative procedures section where you talk through how the in-depth interviews were developed, what types of questions did they involve, how were these questions developed. Again, you usually refer them to a table that contains the actual questions that you interviewed people on, and then you talk about why the questions can be trusted and why the responses will actually lead toward believable qualitative data. This is just a continuation where we talk about how the interviews were conducted and basically the attempts you made to make sure that you got good quality data from your participants. You ensured them of confidentiality, you transcribed and audio taped for consistency, and even here's a couple sentences for how you protected the authenticity of the data. So in this case, how did you make sure the data was accurate and valid? Well, you gave the transcripts back to the participants for their review, and then you actually brought another expert into the analysis process so that they could review your findings as well in order to ensure that your data is believable and authentic. Here's an example of a quantitative survey procedure section where you discuss the survey that you'll use, the types of questions that are on the survey, how the reliability and validity has been determined, and therefore why the reader can trust the results. So we've reached the final part of the method section. This is the analysis, where you tell the reader how you analyze your data. So for quantitative research, you discuss the statistical technique that you used. So if you compared multiple groups, you might say, in this case there were 3 groups, so you use an analysis of variance if you want to analyze 3 groups for differences across the groups. So you would say an ANOVA will be used to examine the effects of, and then you list your independent variable, a 10-week intervention, and then you list your dependent variable on maximal strength in your sample, elite college basketball players, if that's the case. If you're doing a survey where you might compare the results of your survey across 3 different groups. So basically you indicate the statistical technique, and then you reiterate your variables that you will actually analyze. In a qualitative research, you would discuss how you analyze your textual data to build themes. So you have to go way back a few weeks, 4 weeks or so, to the recording on qualitative data analysis to remind yourself of the process. But basically we talk about how we inductively, that's the process, inductively built from your transcripts or from your observations, how you built themes that explain your data, that provide a general understanding or theory related to your qualitative data. So here's an example of how you'll analyze the transcripts and how you'll develop codes that become themes that become grounded theory, or that become high-level qualitative theory. Okay? So then here's another example of a quantitative correlation, which we haven't discussed this in detail yet, but a correlation is just basically relating 2 variables. I want to determine the relationship between 2 variables. Let's say gender and success as collegiate Division I coaches. Of course, we think both genders are equally as successful, but let's say we want to measure the success in specific ways, wins, losses, or cohesion among their teams, or success as measured from those that they lead. Whatever your variables are, the correlation, again, seeks to relate the strength between 2 variables. What is the strength of the relationship, and what is the direction of the relationship? Do they both head in the same direction? As one variable is positive, does the other stay positive? Or as one variable goes up, does the other variable go up? Or do they operate inversely? So you can still have a strong relationship, but let's say the more time you practice a skill, let's say in golf, the lower your skill goes. So that would be an example of an inverse relationship. As your number of minutes of practice in golf increase, your score decreases. And that's a good thing. That means there's a strong relationship. It's just indirect. As one goes up, the other goes down. All right. So there you go. There's your crash course on how to write the methods section. I'll remind you again, there are examples of method sections in Blackboard. Make sure to look at those, as well as your previous articles that you've reviewed for your introduction. And then we'll continue the conversation in class. But for now, I wanted to give you the heads up and get you going on the method section, since you will need to write a draft of this before our course ends. One quick word here to say the rest of this presentation talks through how to get good data from a qualitative perspective. So for those of you who are writing qualitative proposals, this will be helpful for you as you write the methods section. Remember those 2 words that we talked about. Trustworthiness and authenticity are synonymous with reliability and validity. In other words, is my data consistent, and is it believable or valid? These are both types of research care about these ideas, They just use different terms to express reliability and validity. So take a look at that, and we'll probably discuss that again in class as well. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and I will see you soon.